And that's him there, and that's him there twice. So as you can see, I thought I'd put it up on the screen so that if I screw it up again, there it is, you can read it. So Chris has been making maps for the last 20 years, inspired by a love of nature and the topographic maps that reveal the interconnection of the natural world. And the CCA members who heard him speak 2 years ago in Ottawa were, I think, pretty much overwhelmed by his passion, both for the nature and mapping. So trained at St. Clement College as a digital cartographer. He started AsTheCrowFlies Cartography in 2004, working with environmental organizations, making maps to educate and inspire politicians and the general public to greater protect the natural world, along with some fanciful maps to accompany books and films. For the last 8 years, Chris has been making all the cartographic content for the Royal Canadian Geographic Society and the magazine Canadian Geographic. He's created hundreds of maps for the magazine and a dozen giant flow maps, with 3 more currently in development. And he lives in Limehouse, Ontario, which looks like a lovely little hamlet, with his wife and children. So please welcome Chris Brackley to give the keynote presentation.
Well, thank you, Roger, and thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It is really a very real honor to be able to share with you my experience of developing probably the map that I am the most proud of having created. I'm sure I've made thousands of maps over the last 15 or 20 years, and never have I had a project that I was so curious to do a good job at, nor have I had a project that I was so nervous about succeeding in. And we will see. You guys can help me be the judge in terms of whether there was a success or failure in the end of this project. The project, of course, was seen earlier. It is this giant floor map that is associated with the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. It was a project that Canadian Geographic began in 2017, and it is one of the many giant floor maps, 12 or so, that I've created so far. Little introduction, I guess. Roger gave that little bio, so you've got a sense. AsTheCrowFlies Cartography was the company I started 15 years ago. I've been doing freelance work ever since, and Canadian Geographic and the Royal Canadian Geographic Society remain my #1 client. Lots of maps to make. But map making for me started at this place, and if you saw my talk 2 years ago, you'll have a bit of a sense of this. I'm going to do a little retread just so we get a sense of where I came from and what I brought to this project. This is the summer camp I went to in Algonquin Park, Camp Pathfinder. You can see the beautiful red canoes on the canoe dock there. It's a canoe tripping camp, and I spent every summer from age 13 to age 28 on the island and out in the park. Canoe tripping is the very core of this place, and I got to see Algonquin, just about every square inch of it, over the course of the first 10 or 15 years of my time up there. Getting deep into nature is what canoe tripping experience is all about, and it connected me to land in a way that has eventually grown into a love of land to the point where I wanted to share that love in some way. I've done environmental education in my time, but I found that the graphic representation through maps matched my interest in art and my passion for land. Now, when you canoe trip in Algonquin Park, here's the map that you get to use. It's a map that any canoe tripper who's been in Algonquin pores over. This is a little section of it, and it really is it just feels like potential and possibility. The kids sit there, and I did, and charted out my route. I wanted to go to that lake because it was big, and I wanted to go to this lake because it had a cool name, whatever it was. This is really a connection between the land and the cartography was rooted in this map. This map served me very well and served all of us at the camp very well for a long time. But at some point, maybe 10 or 12 years on into my career there, I was pretty senior as a staff person, and I started to get curious I did an environmental education undergrad, and I got to do a plant collection, and so I got a little deeper off the trail and started to see that some of the diversity of the land that was there that I hadn't noticed before. Identifying plants opened up the world and made me see in a way that I hadn't seen before. And it got me interested in something that I've since come to call the land between. Everything that isn't on the pink route. To me, that's the most magical place in the world. It's about 4 steps away from the path, and it's a completely different world. And I spent the last 4 or 5 years at the camp with my topo sheets, getting myself and the kids into the bush. Off we would go tramping through the bush. I love Algonquin because it's a fairly, well, first of all, it's logged as a provincial park. So I always felt like it was a place that wasn't, neither is it pristine. Of course, it's a second growth. It had been logged in the 1800s. And I feel like it's very resilient, and it was able to stand up to me being able to go wherever I wanted. So I took the kids off into the bush. And the NTS sheets, this is the 1 to 50s. I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with these beautiful maps. This one was in my map drawer and enjoyed by some mice at some point. They didn't quite reflect my experience of the land. If you know the NTS sheets, it's a very monochromatic kind of even-toned topographic map feel to them, which is the right approach cartographically for a piece like this. There is no real hierarchy. It's just kind of all there. But I spent one summer, or one winter, I guess, a woefully underemployed winter when I wasn't at the island, hand-inking the 15 sheets that make up Algonquin Park. So I traced all of the lines like a young geography student would with a crayon, added yellow for the bogs because the bogs became some of my favorite places in Algonquin, and I added the management zones. I added the canoe routes, which weren't on the topo sheets. I added historical logging camps, and I added the height of land in blue. And these were things that I was learning about the land. Of course, the topo lines are there, and the lines of latitude and longitude to shoot your bearings when you get off into the bush. This map started to feel like the place that I was coming to know. This was a map that reflected my experience of the place. And as much as the original canoe tripping map was the heart and soul of where I had come from, it didn't have enough information, and it didn't reflect my experience over time. This was a map that did. And this was really the start, obviously, of my cartographic aspirations. So step forward 18 years from when I was doing these, and I get the news that we're going to be doing an Indigenous Atlas of Canada with an associated giant floor map. I was completely thrilled and completely terrified. What was this going to look like? I really didn't know how I was going to approach this thing. But one thing that I knew was that it runs through just about any of the cartography that I do, that trying to reflect the experience of the people for whom the map theme is based is what I try to do. Now, I don't know the people and the stories of Canadian Geographic. I haven't met them. So I do my best to understand from where they come and try to reflect the experience I see written into their articles, or if I'm working for a client to make a map of their property, I want to get a sense of what it is, what the land means to them, and reflect that in the piece that I generate. And for Indigenous peoples, their experience of being on the map is very limited. Typically, Indigenous peoples are not on the map, and yet their connection to land is so intimate and central to their experience. And so I knew it was important to do a great job of somehow reflecting the Indigenous experience on the land, and yet I knew, of course, that it was such a rich and varied and diverse experience that I just couldn't imagine how it was going to happen. I was also terrified because, as many of you in this room will know, data around Indigenous peoples, there certainly is lots of data around Crown Indigenous relations, but really that bottom-up data around the Indigenous experience, I knew it was going to be difficult to find, specifically and significantly at a national scale. Now, as I say, that really was my biggest concern going into it. I knew that we were working with Indigenous partners, and I hoped that through that communication I was going to get a better sense of how they saw the land and what they wanted to see on this. This was directed undoubtedly by the Indigenous partners, who were, in this case, the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, who was our point people for the Métis was the Gabriel Dumont Institute, ITK, or Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, which is the sort of umbrella organization that manages settlement lands in Nunavut for all of the north for the Inuit. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and Inspire, an education organization that does Indigenous education. Of course, I had my team at Canadian Geographic, so Haneen was our project coordinator. She was amazing at liaising and moving things forward. Our education team, these giant floor maps, when they travel, they go with a tickle trunk full of educational activities. There's about 10 activities per giant floor map, and so when it arrives at a school for free, they stay for 2 weeks, lay out on the school gym as they did at my school in Limehouse, and the educational activities are there. And a lot of the context, some of these maps are hard for me to make because the education team says, don't put that on the map. It breaks my heart, I can't put all the information I want on the map because we're going to do it in the educational activities. But they're a great team, and they definitely were the ones working directly with the Indigenous teachers to make this map reflect their experience and what they wanted it to say. So where to begin? How on earth was this going to begin? For me, inevitably, I usually get a map subject and I dive right into the internet and I start looking for data to see what I have to work with. What's the fodder that I can build this thing with? In this case, I wanted to step a little level higher and just get a little bit of a grounding in terms of understanding who it was that I was mapping. And I will say with some embarrassment, as I will throughout this talk, reveal my ignorance at the simplest aspects of how Indigenous peoples exist. In my case, though it sounds cold, I think a cartographer is always looking to put things in groups, to categorize, to organize, to select, to group. I mean, these are classic cartographic approaches. And so even this simple notion, though of course I knew of all these groups, it didn't occur to me conceptually in my mind when I thought of Indigenous peoples, 3 groups, boom. But of course, there are First Nations in Canada. These numbers are from 2016 census. There are the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. Of course, those were our partners. And that, just at the highest level, the simplest terms, was something that was context for me. I associated this graphic stylings with them. Purple was going to be for First Nations, magenta for Inuit, and blue for Métis. That was a starting point, just a little bit of a high level for myself. Then I started looking for data. Started with old maps to see what I could find, and you dig up maps like this one. This is 1939 from the University of California. But of course, it had the kind of things that I was looking for. It had the names of some of the tribes as described in 1939, and some boundaries. Of course, I'm looking for things like polygons. I want to be able to define things. But of course, this didn't really have a lot of provenance. I didn't know the metadata. I didn't know from whence this information came. Maps like this really were hard to qualify, and this kind of stuff wasn't going to work for what I was doing. I found beautiful old maps. I love the illustrated old map like this. But of course, a map like this is the sort of thing that not only has, I'm sure, some sort of previous errors in terms of the way that it labels or names or represents. This is a map that's showing the historical state, sort of the state of affairs at the point of contact for the different Indigenous groups. But I couldn't help but notice as I looked at this map that it had some sort of prescient message on it. It's 1964 and an advertising company created this map. I don't know why. But it said on there as a little sort of asterisk, many tribal names are those given by white men. It is said that we know very little about some tribes, and that some no longer exist. Some are now in other locations than those shown here. And I think the rub of mapping Indigenous peoples was alluded to in this. Naming. Whose name? Our name, or the colonial name that has been put upon peoples, and the movement of Indigenous peoples. Peoples were dynamic in their very existence before Europeans ever came, continued to be dynamic in their presence on the land, and of course were pushed off of so many places. So where and when and what's the name? These were questions that I knew were going to be part of the experience of doing this map. This was going to be a modern map. There was no question to me. And it was a map that needed to show the state of, it's for an atlas, and an atlas is always about what the particular subject matter looks like at the time of publication. There are innumerable projects that have been done in the past and are continuing to go on from bottom up, collection of information from elders, from people who are out on the land, that are mind-blowingly amazing. To me, these sorts of graphics say so much about the use of the land, the way that the Inuit, in this case, are moving over so much of a great part of the land, and their intimate knowledge of animals and plants and everything. I mean, to me, a map like this says that these people are of the land. As much as I thought I was of Algonquin, my understanding of my content doesn't even touch the sort of depth of experience and connection that this one represents. But these kinds of maps are very localized, and there is no one data set that's going to show the use of land or across the country for all peoples. So this kind of approach was going to be a non-starter with the time that we had and with the data that existed. Now there is this website that many of you may have seen, get my water, called nativeland.ca, put together by a guy named Victor Temperano. And I thought to myself when I saw this, well, traditional territories, polygons. This is going to be a potential resource. I had my suspicions. Polygons are obviously very coarse. And when I started talking to Victor, he said, he described his work as truly a work in progress. It is very well researched. If you go to this site, you'll see, when I talked to him, it was just him doing it. Now he's got a whole team of people who are working with him. It's really growing in development, and it's crowdsourced, and people are improving the content constantly. But it is not complete. It is a work in progress. Everything on the website will give caveats and asterisks to say this is a work in progress. Don't take it as the gospel truth. And despite the fact that he was certainly willing to share it, you know, the pitfalls that I saw in, you know, that little statement on that 64 map were echoed in some of the comments on the webpage for this. Things like someone commenting to say, I wanted to submit a correction to the Zapotec territories, currently marked as Didzatson. It is actually Didzatza. Also, that's a language, not the territory. Another one, this map is using settler-appointed Navajo, when indigenous people here clearly distinguish and identify themselves as Diné people and speak the language Diné Bizad. So it is dynamic in some ways, language, names, all of these aspects, and though Victor had done great work, I knew that this wasn't going to be clear, clean, and vetted enough to be something that we could hang our hat on. So after having done my initial research and learning what I could, I spoke with the Assembly of First Nations specifically because the territorial diversity of First Nations is the most diverse and the most challenging to do in a meaningful way. And when I spoke with them, I asked them, of course, did they have traditional territory data across the country? They said no. But they suggested, and this really was the cornerstone of how the whole thing moved forward, that I go to census data. And I go to census data not for traditional territories, but that I go to census data for language. Now, Victor had a language tab here, and he does have an analog for this for languages, but is in that similar state of evolution, of first swipe, of a work in progress. And the census data, at the census subdivision level, has 4,000 odd polygons denoting who is speaking what language today. Bottom up. This is from people self-reporting that they speak this language. We chose language spoken at home. If you know the census, there are all kinds of different parsings of language, mother tongue, different things. Language spoken at home seemed like it was a living language that was being spoken. We got that data. AFN had some good contacts at StatsCan, and they accelerated the processing of the 2016 data for language. And we created this map for the magazine. 4,000 census subdivisions, languages spread across the country. And we got the numbers, we got the geography, and it was today. And that was something that I felt good about hanging my hat on and saying, this is where languages exist today. You can't see it well on this slide, but you know, the language, specific languages themselves are written there. The language groups, Algonquian, Athabascan, etc. Great diversity of languages in BC are represented there by the volume of speakers. Pretty map, proportional circles, one of my favorite stylings of maps. And this went out in the magazine as a pull-out poster. And I knew this was going to be the root of what I could do. And really, from the get-go, I knew, and I know, as I think we all do, that Indigenous peoples have always occupied pretty much all of Canada, full stop. So the map, to say the right message, had to say all of Canada has an Indigenous connection. There is a connection between the people and the place throughout. So I had a suspicion that from this I could build a map where I could paint all of Canada with the language colors, and we would have a sense of the indigeneity of all of Canada. Now, to get, I had enough to start at this point, so I thought it's time to actually get into the map. What I'm going to do now is just construct the map step by step, essentially reconstruct the map for you so that you can see what's on there. My maps, if you've seen my work in the magazine or in other places, tend to be thick. I love the interconnectedness of different layers and what it says. It's all about relations, right? Maps tell you something because this is related to that is that. That's what's unique about maps. It's not a table, it says this relates to that, to this, spatially. So I always want lots on a map, and I am so lucky to have found myself in a place where I get to make 11 by 8 meter maps. A lot of real estate to be able to put thick content on. So, where do I start? Like any cartographer in the modern world, of course it's going to begin with a nice hillshade. You got to have it. This is going to tell me now, in the back of my mind as I'm building it, I know I want to paint this with color. So I'm not going to be able to use color for other things that I often do on a map, but I can clearly use texture, and mountains are significant, obviously, to the Indigenous experience, to any human experience, plains, etc. That's a piece of the puzzle. Land cover is where I always go next on my maps, almost inevitably. If I can get it in there, I'm going to put land cover because everything happens in a real place. The fact that something happens on the forest or on the plains or up in the tundra is always relevant to me. That's the human experience. You exist in a kind of a landscape. The prairies are different from the forest, different from the mountains and the glaciers. I want them on there when I can, but I knew color wasn't going to be an option. So I stepped back and said, I'm going to roll this and pull what I can from it and use texture and tone to be able to pull it. So urban areas, very significant. That's where cities are. That's a key route to any sort of experience of the land. And the forest, I figured I could pull those two things from it. So I pulled them. You'll see it doesn't show very well on any of these slides, but there's a sort of a texture there that it's not just a color that represents the forest, and the urban area is shown again in a sort of muted background thing. And then I was ready to paint the map. So I brought in, we had to deal with the ocean a little bit. Bathymetry is just pretty, I love it, so we always throw it on just about any map. Gotta have it, just because. Good color, good contrast. But more significantly for the Indigenous experience, and for the Inuit in particular, sea ice. It's one of my passions as well. I hate seeing the Arctic Ocean without sea ice. There's always some sea ice up there. To show it as water is somehow to do it a disservice. So I always put sea ice whenever I can. I generated a satellite mosaic at some point for one of the floor maps. This is June, I believe, and we see sort of icy bits breaking up. I think it's gorgeous, but also critically important for the experience of the Inuit in the north, and that the land and the water are connected in this very meaningful way. And then to paint it. So I brought the proportional circles that I had from the other map into this piece, laid them out over it. I brought in some, this is Victor's language data, just to give me a generalized sense of it. I had some other maps as references as well, to sort of cross-reference, because of course, the proportional circles aren't complete and explicit for every inch of the land and landscape, so that was sort of a starting point. And also it sort of bled us into the states, which, the Canadian-American border is not a hard border for Indigenous peoples in a functional and real way. So I wanted to be able to bleed those language areas as they exist in the states as well. And after processing it through, we kind of had our base map that I was going to be able to work from. So we see the Algonquian and the Siouan and all the many languages out here, Inuit, the Athabascan languages. And now I'm going to take you to my favorite world, Adobe Illustrator, to step this map together. Adobe is, of course, or Illustrator is really the heart of all the mapping that I do. It's where the work always takes place. Of course, undoubtedly, on a map like this, you got to have the hydrography. You got to see the rivers and lakes. This is obviously a critical part of all Canadians' experience, but particularly so for Indigenous peoples. But then I wanted to qualify these as I had done on the other map, and I wanted to add the languages, specifically the names of the languages, because color is great, and you get a sense that something's happening here, but from what I understand of people's geographic and cartographic literacy, people read maps often very shallowly. I'm sad, I'm sorry to say, and they don't see all of the great work that I've put into them. Now, I can handle that and I can live with it. But wherever possible, if I can hit them over the head with a hammer for some piece of information, I will make it just clear as heck that something is on there that they want to see or that they need to see. And so I knew from the get-go that sort of that beautiful classic old curved arced label for languages was a great one. It didn't define things explicitly. It didn't have to have a polygon boundary. I could just show the labels of where languages were being spoken. So again, I brought the proportional circles into Illustrator. And just as a curious exercise, this was the layering of the individual languages as they existed coming out of the data, so that I could get all the individual languages on their own, so that I could get the circles, the smaller circles on top of the bigger circles. The exercise of putting all of these circles, I believe there was maybe 550 layers to start with. The processing, all of this is very manual. I hope to learn something about how to better process data in databases, but I just sort of hack it out every time I have to. So I had this, and what I could do with this was put on the language labels, not only where they were geographically in a fairly true sense, but also scale them, the labels themselves, to the relative number of speakers. So where there was a density of Dene speakers up here, there's a bigger label. Where there's a very few Plains Cree speakers here, the label is smaller. That's intuitive, I hope, I think. So readers, when they come on the map, they get a sense that there's a whole lot of Cree here, and a little bit of Stoney and Dakota here. And it was obvious. I didn't keep the proportional circles, they were sort of working pieces. Oops. Uh-oh. Now we've stepped ahead. And a note on the language labels themselves. As I said, I knew from the get-go that the actual verbiage, the wording of individual languages, of individual nations, was going to be something of a challenge to do in a way that honored the way that each individual nation or language speaker related to that language. Was the word correct? And I have no doubt that in some cases, there is no doubt things like carrier or beaver are not the indigenous name for that language. They remain on this map because they were the way that the census data was collected. I think, as many would agree in this room, consistency of data use, not rejigging things sort of out of context or with an inconsistent manner is a good general approach. Now that said, despite the fact that the language as they exist here, the language labels in English and in French, really are the way that they came down from the census, from the state, government of Canada, there were instances where we would speak with a particular Indigenous person or group who would say, no, you really can't put that label, we need to switch it to something else. Or subtly redefine the dialects in some places. So it's inconsistent, but we certainly wanted to honor any of our partners wherever we could. And so some places, the language labels were changed. But I have no doubt that there will be some who will see the language labels as they exist and not feel that it was done perfectly right. This map is a great start, I like to think. I have no doubt that it is imperfect in many ways and that there is a lot of work to do in the future to improve the communication around how we label, place, all of these sorts of things. Next, of course, if we're going to be mapping, as I say, fully national data across all of the country was something that was hard to get at the best of times. And the one place where I could get it really was the federal government. And that I had that sanction essentially from the AFN right from the get-go. The government data had credibility in their eyes. Allowed me some latitude to feel like I could use federal data to put onto this map. And what you'll see as this map evolves, and as I started to understand it, was really what this map came to be, is a map not of how Indigenous people see themselves in their own right. That's something that, through a lack of data at the very least, was just not an option. But really this map turned into a map of Crown Indigenous relations, which is a very real part of Indigenous people's experience, and it's a very important story to tell, I like to think. In the notion of reconciliation, this is a story about Europeans as they relate with Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples as they relate with European peoples who have come. And clearly at the very heart of those relations are the treaty boundaries. Now this, of course, is a very ubiquitous data set, easy to find, and we put the treaty boundaries on as step one. You know, seeing the treaty boundaries, maps like this always, I'm always reading them as I'm making them and sort of getting curious about the things that I see. I guess I knew it, but when I saw there was no historical treaty before 1975 in Quebec, I've seen maps with it before, but again, it's one of those things you see and you go, oh God, wow, yeah, one of those things. And again, I always hope a few light bulbs go off when people see the interrelations that exist on the maps that I make. That was one for me. The outcome, one of the outcomes of the treaties, of course, were the reserves and the system of reserves across Canada. So I got the reserves onto the map across the country, and these relate to the treaties. But there's no people on this map yet. There are no communities, and I had to figure out where and how to put the people, the communities, most importantly, the nations. As I said in my sort of blurb for what this talk was going to be about, it's about mapping nations within nations. I was so taken by the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau, very early in his term, suggested he was going to have a nation-to-nation dialogue. To me, that was new, to hear that it was nations and nations, nations within nations. It's in the word First Nation, so it's sort of a no surprise, but again, a recontextualization for me that these are nations. And we're going to speaking nations to nations, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to map the nations as bounded areas. They don't exist that way. There are no borders quite to map. So I had to find, what are, in this case, we're going to start with the First Nations. Who are the First Nations? How many are they? Where are they? Turns out there are 634 First Nations. Formerly known to a great degree as the bands that essentially were obviously very real groupings of peoples from the past, but were defined explicitly through these agreements. And there are 634 bands across the country. So I put, the data was great, again, government sources. The government, of course, is very acutely aware of where the First Nations are across the country. The question of labeling and language is ongoing, and most of these are anglicized names. In many cases, we did a lot of work over the course of time to either bracket out the anglicized name or bracket out the Indigenous name for their own nation. Again, as consistent as we could make it, as inclusive and as we would listen to Indigenous peoples wherever we could to improve and change. But again, this is government source data. And the location that you see on here is the band office as a heart. Of course, that's not the only place that the First Nations live on the reserves, but that was a place you could hang your hat, essentially as a graphic piece to be able to see where these individual First Nations were. And on the same website that serves up the band or First Nation data comes data about tribal councils, something I'd never heard of before. There are tribal councils. Tribal councils are sort of structure of organization through which multiple bands may be united in some form. It's very highly variable, as I understand it. I'm no expert. Through a tribal council. So there's associations there. And I'm trying to map them as nations, and I want to see the connections. I want to understand better how the structure of the Indigenous peoples, First Nations in this case, exist across the landscape. So on that website, they had this pretty cool interactive map, which connected all the First Nations themselves with the tribal councils. I thought, okay, cool, okay, so there's sort of another sort of structural, governmental, associative connection for these nations. They are grouped in some ways. And I even like the symbolization that they use, though a little coarse and flat. So I thought, there it is. That works. I can use that. So I tried it, and I brought it in, and I thought I am going to connect here we go. We're going to try it. I'm going to try and see whether I can connect. Oh, we didn't get the tribal councils on here. So the tribal councils are in purple squares, and we see the connections that we start to see. Okay, well, Battleford Agency Tribal Chiefs Incorporated is connected to X number. Start to see a bit of a geography, a bit of a connection, a bit of a story, the pattern of how these nations exist, how they're connected. But then I thought to myself, and a frustration that I've long had, there's all these reserve parcels that I don't know who's connected to them. I hate a loose hanging end, geographically or graphically. How do these bits connect? I've made maps before where I put a label on it that says Red Pheasant 107B, something like that, for the name of the individual parcel, because each of these parcels do have a name. It's not meaningful. I didn't even know how to interpret those things. What I eventually found was there was a table that connected every single of the 4,000 reserve parcels to the individual nation that was connected to that. This was one of those ones where cardinality almost killed me. There's many to one, there's one to many. There's all kinds of relationships. Some parcels are connected to 10 nations, some nations have one. It was a challenge. But I was up to it because I thought it was an important piece of the puzzle that we needed to see. So I, again in my infinitely manual manner, got all exported into Illustrator, all of the numbers associated, band 342, okay, and I spent about 4 days drawing the airplane arcs to connect these things so that we started to see the pattern of how individual nations, just essentially, this is the geography of the Muslimin nation. This is the lands that they have that they're connected to in terms of having some usage rights that are particular. Of course, this is absolutely incomplete in terms of traditional territory, land use, land occupancy, but knowing that I couldn't do that, this was a piece of the puzzle. This was a piece of how the First Nations and Indigenous people spread across the country and how they connected. So this suddenly gives you these patterns. I love to see the spread. Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation is my favorite aesthetically, and one of my favorites because of the immense geographic spread. The fact that reserves are outside of the treaty boundaries. I still don't quite have that straight in my head how that happened, but stories are implicit in this, to me, like a million stories. Why all these pieces? I don't know, but to me it asks an interesting question. On to the Métis. Mapping the Métis. One thing that I knew from having done other maps in the past was that the Métis in blue, as I said from my earlier sort of paradigm, had some little chunk of land to call their own. I do believe the Métis own these settlements in Alberta. The government of Alberta has ceded ownership to these lands for 8 parcels of land in Alberta. So that's critical and an important piece of the puzzle when we look at the Métis. But of course the Métis exist from British Columbia through to Ontario. And how to get them on the map? Well, I worked with the Gabriel Dumont Institute, and there is a very real political structure in the Métis nation. It exists at the provincial level, so there are individual organizations at a provincial level, and at a sub-level to that, I have a sort of description from the Métis National Council to help me understand better how the structure worked, which was that Métis citizens mandate the governance structures through province-wide ballot box elections held at regular intervals for regional and provincial leadership. They and their communities also participate in these Métis governance structures by way of either elected locals or community councils. And it's those locals that ended up being the thing that we could hang our hat on to be able to show where the Métis were across the land. And the rationale was if there was a Métis local in a town, there is a real population of Métis in and around that area. And again, I could have gone to the census, but it's a bit fraught to get Métis data out of the census, and I would have gotten sort of a centroid from a polygon to show where Métis are, and that's not really where they live. And this had to be specific, given the size. I wanted to see something real. So we added the towns where Métis have a local. There's over 100 in each of the Central Prairie provinces, maybe 50 or so. I don't remember exactly in BC, a few in Ontario. And again, you start to see this patterning where you see, unsurprisingly, I guess no one's more surprised by unsurprising things than me. But you see that there's this great association between the geography of where Métis people are and where the First Nations are. And it's interesting to see them sitting side by side in one place. Then to the north. Modern treaties are a bit of a different kettle of fish. As I've learned, all of this such new news to me. In the modern treaties, things signed post-75, we call them 75 because that's a significant date because treaties were settlement agreements were signed in Quebec in 77 and 78. And in the north, Settlement agreements were signed in the 90s and the 2000s. So we'll just head up to, if we can, we'll head up to the Yukon to be able to see some of the lay of the land there. The Métis, this is one of those cartographic nightmares that you always end up with in some of these sorts of things, which is overlapping polygons. This is the nature of the post-75 treaties, certainly in the Yukon. And we see the boundaries of these lands, or of the settlement agreements, overlapping all over the place. So it's a bit of a mess, but again, I had a lot of real estate, so I think it's clear enough to see when you get into it the spread of the geography of how this works. And in the result of the settlement agreements were settlement lands that were truly, again, title ceded from the Crown to the First Nations specifically. And they were ceded specifically to individual First Nations. So in this case, we see the Kluane First Nation Final Agreement in 2003, the boundary of it in orange, and we see that the Kluane First Nation, I guess we need to get, an aspect that I did manage to miss on the way. I didn't give up on the notion of connecting First Nations with their tribal councils. So you'll see throughout in the south, and when you get onto the map a little bit later, you'll see that instead of using the airplane arcs to connect tribal councils with the different First Nations that are connected to them, I use color. So you'll see a tribal council in green, and any green First Nation dot throughout the map is a member of that tribal council. So I used color in order to connect those. In this case in the north, instead of using color to connect, instead of using airplane arcs to connect the First Nation with the individual lands to which they were connected, the pieces were bigger, they were more geographically grouped, and there was far less First Nations involved in this, so I used color. So I used an infill to clearly suggest that the Kluane First Nation was part of this settlement agreement, and the orange color in the center, or around the outside, represents that they are the nation that is connected to these particular parcels of land. I didn't want to lose the tribal council affiliation, so I made that dot smaller, and they are connected to the Southern Shoshone Tribal Council. Then we went, heading north is the Inuit. And the Inuit are not organized in the same structure exactly. They live not on reserves, but in true communities, many of which were put upon them. But clearly, the data existed. The ITK has done a lot of work around that earlier map that we saw of Baffin Island. Specific detailed work around bottom-up kind of collection of data. But even more so, or not more so, but certainly they've done a lot of work to collect information about the individual communities, languages, and all of those sorts of things. So they had good data for me to work with. Not only in terms of language, for the naming of towns and communities. Again, an ever-changing and evolving thing. A lot of communities in the north have an English name, Cambridge Bay, whatever it is. But of course, there's an Inuit name for those as well, and an Inuktitut name for those. And so we managed to put all of those on the map, as well as the Inuktitut name in syllabics, because they had that information. Always a wrestle to try and get the software to want to manage syllabics. But in the same way, modern agreements were signed in the north, and this is all just this sort of understanding of how the structure of Crown-Indigenous relationships have gone in the 2000s, and this color infill for the pink areas, which are Inuit-owned settlement lands, connect to individual cities. And I've mapped all of the settlement lands in the north before, but never had I quite realized that specifically the individual settlement lands are tied to one specific community. So there is a connectivity between these yellow areas and the specific town or community who has ownership of those lands. So you'll see the variety of colors throughout, and each one of those different color tones relates to a particular community and their ownership of that land. So again, we're starting to see the structure of how the land has been parsed out, how it exists in the eyes of this colonial and Indigenous relationship. In the north, of course, they actually have something that is the closest to the traditional sort of view of nationhood. Now, of course, these boundaries aren't binding in quite the way that governmental binding would be, but I learned of and never had heard of before, that all of the lands occupied by the Inuit are referred to as Inuit Nunangat. And so all of the north and over in Quebec is Inuit Nunangat, and there are 4 regions within it: Inuvialuit, Nunavut, Nunatsiavut, and Nunavik. This is another one of those things that, is starting to appear on some maps. You can see it occasionally, but it has defined boundaries. So for a cartographer, it was ideal to be able to show that there is a boundary for Nunavik as it runs along the south. Again, not exactly the controlling governmental agency in the area, but a very real organization that helps to manage, as I understand, the settlement lands that came out of the agreements. Now, obviously, not all First Nations live in the communities from which they came in Nunavut, or in the north, or on reserve. And so it was important to me that we see where other Indigenous peoples lived across the country. And to do that, we went back to the census. The data wasn't processed for I don't even know what they call it, I guess, but there is a category for different Indigenous groups and where they live, and by city. And so what I decided to do was we wanted to show cities that had significant Indigenous populations. That's part of the Indigenous experience, undoubtedly. So I, somewhat arbitrarily, we tried to find a cutoff that was meaningful, that would show a good suite of cities across the country, but not cover the map in cities with very small populations of Indigenous people. So if there was more than 2,000 First Nations, more than 1,000 Métis, or more than 500 Inuit, I categorized those as a significant number, and we added those cities to the map. So we see big cities. Prince George makes the cut for having, which was very beneficial to the students yesterday in order that they could find themselves on the map. But we use that symbolization that you saw earlier. So we see in Toronto that there is a First Nations and Inuit population of significance in Toronto. Part of the story, it has to be. Sadly, in terms of stories or things that have to be part of the story, is residential schools. One of our partners was National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, so there was no doubt that we had to see the geography and the history of residential schools. So all of the 139 or so residential schools are listed on this map with the name. The last piece of data was one that I was sure I would never get my hands on, and I was thrilled that I was able to. I worked long and hard discussing and talking about the intention and the use and the symbolization that I was going to use for this map with Aboriginal and Northern Affairs Canada, whatever they're rebranded to these days. And after long conversations, they agreed that they would distill all of the unsettled land claims into one set of massive polygons. Of course, there are overlapping outstanding land claims throughout Canada, but they would give me one dumb polygon set that showed all of the outstanding land claims throughout Canada. And I got to put it on the map. And to me, that's obviously such a huge story. You want to come up? No, there we go. And so you will see it on the map. Looks weird on here, but there's a purple dotted pattern for anywhere where there's an outstanding land claim. As many of you I'm sure will know, Ottawa still has an unreserved or unsettled land claim. My beloved Algonquin has an unsettled land claim. The Algonquins of Golden Lake. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. Of course, you will see, and I know I've been focused on the center and the east on my walking around this map. You will see BC when you go and have a look. Pretty sure all of BC has unsettled land claims throughout the entirety of the province. And that has to be a part of the story. It's ongoing and it's unfinished. So, that was all the layers. Just that small number of pieces of information that I was going to put on this map. Tidy little piece. And there it is. The final map. In partnership with the Indigenous partners and the teachers, the education team, they put this timeline around the outside, which is fascinating to read and look at. And aesthetically beautiful. They did a great job on the design. And there it is, the final giant floor map. To round out my talk today, I just want to sort of suggest what I think we managed to succeed at and where I think the future may lie. Things that are going to come out of this for me, significantly, one, I now have a way to be able to meaningfully show First Nations particularly But indeed, Inuit and First Nations in the north, in terms of how they exist on the land. The fact that on a general base map, reserves and band names and First Nation names and Inuit communities are there because they're in the town population data set. But the fact that they aren't typically on a map that you see is a glaring omission. And it reminds me of the fact that when I saw Dances with Wolves when I was 18 years old and was totally moved by a piece which I know, I'm sure, is imperfect in so many ways, but made me lament the fact that the First Nations were gone from Canada. This is in 1990. That was what I knew at 18. I thought I was a pretty smart kid. That's crazy, right? And I think one of the pieces of the puzzle is that they're not on the map. So both myself and Canadian Geographic Editorial are going to aspire in the future to include some of this content that was generated from this on maps as a general rule of thumb. It's something that needs to change. The last piece of the puzzle, of course, is the future, and how can we map Indigenous experience on the land, this landmass in Canada better. And what I couldn't find originally was the traditional territories. There has been so much work done on this. Many nations know very explicitly where their traditional territories are. Some do not have it defined. But there is no one universal data set that has been normalized and brought together to represent traditional territories in Canada. It's a glaring error. I don't know how we can move forward with reconciliation without knowing what land each individual nation has real connection, history, use, and connection to. So I think that's something that I really hope somehow gets motivated to move forward, and I hope to be part of that wherever and whenever the opportunities arise. And the other one is, interestingly, as a wrap-up, the two things, this got a little press when it came out, and I've seen pieces on the CBC. The two things that get said about this map are, one, what isn't on the map, which is a little heartbreaking for the cartographer, but it was very intentional. There are no provincial boundaries. There is as little of the European colonial exclusively content on this as possible, and that was intentional, and that was directed by the First Nations, the Métis, and Inuit, how they wanted it to be represented, which is right. Second thing people say is that it shows traditional territories, which explains the map literacy of many people, because it absolutely does not. But in terms of what isn't on this map, the other thing that you won't see is labels for any of the water features, which is a classic, typical cartographic thing to put on it. But it doesn't take a leap of thinking to understand why putting the colonial name, the anglicized or French name for a water body doesn't make sense on an Indigenous map. The Anishinaabe do not call it Lake Superior. It's just not the right thing. And that is another future that I hope comes to exist, which is the collection of a genuine, legitimate toponymy for Canada that reflects the experience of the individual nations who occupy the territories. These are the kinds of things that we need to see in order to know that Canada is indeed painted by Indigenous peoples from top to bottom, that it is land that has a connection to Indigenous peoples everywhere. And that's it. We are going to go see the map very shortly. I see that there was a microphone put here for questions. If there's any questions that people feel may be of interest to the group at large, I'd be happy to answer them for maybe 5 minutes. And does that work, Roger?
5 minutes max, so we'll
Yeah.
be around.
I really originally intended to just take questions on the map as we're there and have that discussion. I really look forward to sharing this with this astute cartographic set of people who can show me, things that they see when they look at this map, things that work, things that don't. I'm curious to have that interaction. So that's really the intention for it. If you prefer to do that.
Well, I think since we're going there's probably a lot of questions you'll answer while you're standing there, but there might be one or two pressing questions. Byron's waving.
It's really just a point of clarification. It's about the other maps that are in the Indigenous Atlas.
Yeah.
And how those got made. Were you involved with them?
Not very much. We did a few. The intention right from the get-go was that this would be a bottom-up project, that it would be Indigenous maps reflecting the Indigenous experience. Sourcing and finding those in meaningful ways that connected to the themes of the Atlas wasn't always possible. So where possible, it's a map generated by Indigenous, created by Indigenous peoples. But more often than not, it is maps of different places or from different sources. that fit the theme that related to the piece. I did a couple of the maps in there, but you know, the core of it, this map was cut up for the atlas at 1 to 2 million, 1 to 5 million, and placed in as these sort of base maps of the atlas. But yeah, it was a really wide variety of maps that got chosen for the atlas proper. And if you've seen it, it is an atlas in many ways. It has this, so it's a core base, but it is almost more textual and storytelling than it is map-rich, which has been successful. The stories are beautiful in it, so yeah.
I think it might be more suitable if we do head to the map.
Sure.
And I noticed, well, I don't know if they're still there. They were there yesterday, my free socks. So some of you, you'll get a chance, of course, throughout the week to walk there, and may not be much time to walk on it right now. Before we go, there's a small presentation for Chris. Thanks very much from the BG Tourism, a nice leather case.
Thanks, Roger.
Halfway there. And the much prized phrase of the booth, which I didn't even know was the city's logo, and Prince George Mark.
Oh, how great. Always love it.